Hello and welcome to another episode of the Expanse Abridged Podcast series. Today I've got a Holden chapter. It is chapter 11 of Leviathan Wakes, and we get our first taste of space combat in this chapter, which is very exciting. All 11 episodes in the prelude, I said it was a space opera, and finally we're going to get some space combat and see more spaceships, which is always fun. There's also a bit of tragedy, but this is a good chapter. I do enjoy this one. So the last time we saw Holden, he was in the Knight, which is the shuttle from the Canterbury, which had been blown up, and they're on the way to connect with the Donager, which is a Martian battleship. And we didn't get much description of the Donager at that point, but we just knew it was a big boy, and it was very, very serious. So this chapter opens with some more description of the Donager. And the first lines are, the Donager was ugly. So we get some narrative where Holden talks about he's seen kind of sail ships and kind of 20th century battleships, and there's always that they're leaning into the wind, designed to be aerodynamic and going through through the water or using the wind, and they've got to be like cool and a creature barely held on by the leash. And the Donager is none of that, because in space you don't need any of that, and it's built in the office tower configuration, is how it's described, with one deck on another. And gravity with engines at the bottom, and with the engines pushing forward, then you get gravity on every deck. And the Donager is described as looking like an office building on its side, square and blocky, and it's 500 meters long, which is a 130-story building. So, for reference, I googled it. Big Ben in London is about 100 meters, and HMS Queen Elizabeth, which is the British aircraft carrier, which is like she's a big girl. She is only 270 meters long, I think. Yeah, 280. So this thing is still an office block and it's still huge. I think the Burj Khalifa is about 580, so no, 850, I think. So she is a big boy, the ship, this big office block in space. And Holden talks about how much of the human sense of aesthetics has been formed in a time when sleek objects cut through the air. And the Donager will never have that because she's in space. Which I always think is quite an interesting way of approaching kind of spaceships. Because you're a book that's describing space, and a lot of people would normally go for we're going to have these really, really cool spaceships that look really cool. So you can imagine something like Star Wars with the great kind of triangle ships they have for the Empire. And it's interesting how the Expanse kind of, in this kind of practical sense, you see and you probably start to pick up in the few chapters we've discussed so far. They don't go for that. And they're like, no, you will love the office block. The office block is going to be the cool spaceship, which I quite like the way they do that. And so they kind of dock up next to it. Their little shuttle's screaming, loads of warning alarms because it's getting covered in targeting lasers, and Holden can't even spot the turrets that are looking at it. And he gets taken in, and the crew are kind of watching the Donager as he gets closer and closer, and they're like, this thing can kill planets. And they're kind of saying, well, it's easy to kill a planet, you just drop something from orbit, and this thing can kill anything. It's the most powerful ship in the universe at that point in time. And they're finally taken into like a cargo bay, and Holden's like, it just feels like we're being swallowed, rather than being like boarding with them. And they get in, and a big arm grabs them up, and they get onto a docking tube. And Holden's like, boys, we've got to be nice here. And Amos starts obviously swearing and being like, these fuckers killed the previous captain and stuff. And Alex is like, no, you got to be serious. Like the enlisted soldiers, so they're non-officers, they'll be chill, but the officers get their sense of humour trained out of them. And they finally get onto the ship, and they talk kind of extensively, actually, in this chapter about how boring it is. So it's flat grey composites and immaculately clean. And they've got magnetic boots, because at this point there's no thrust, so there's no gravity, so the engines are off. And they meet the captain, who they talked about previously. So she was the one who'd messaged them, so messaged Holden, not like Teams or WhatsApp, but like the space broadcast being like, yo, my dude, there's six Belter ships. I should have mentioned at the start, so they're going to meet the Donager, but there's also 6 mysterious ships on their way over. And the Martian captain was like, boys, what the fuck are you doing? And Holden recognised her from those videos. She's like, yeah, you're welcome aboard, and then immediately has them searched all over. Nice bit of fondling. And Holden describes her as slightly older, a few strands of grey hair, and he could see the softening of age out her jaw and the corners of her eyes, which still had a stony expression that gave away nothing. And she's like, yo, Mr. Holden, those 6 ships are still following us. 2 hours ago, I said, so I said an hour ago, if you don't leave in 2 hours, I'm gonna torpedo you with these like big torpedoes. They've only got an hour to go. If they're friends of yours, let them know. And Holden's just like, I don't know what the fuck they are. Maybe they'll just come to watch, make sure I don't get hurt. And then she's like, all right, cool, fuck off. And they go through the spaceship. And we get more descriptions again about how clean it all is. So I think we've discussed previously Holden's background was he was in the United Navy, so the UN Navy. And he's talking about how going on this Martian battleship, you can just tell it's better than the anything the UN has. Which again, we talked about in the Preluge, whereby Mars has a smaller fleet, but it's far, far better quality. And you kind of get the description now, he's on this Martian ship, and it's like, everything here is just tight, nailed down, sharper than any UN vessel he'd seen before. And Alex is like, of course it's like that. They've got nothing to do in the meantime, apart from just clean. They're on a long flight. And Amos says, see, that's why I work callers. Clean decks or get drunk and screw, and I've got a preference. And as they're going along, the gravity kicks back in, they're accelerating away. And they notice the ships are very quiet because everyone's obviously at duty stations with the unknown 6 Belter ships on their way over. And Holden's thinking about how if she's going to casually kill these 6 ships in, at this point, in an hour's time, she probably would do that to the Canterbury. Kind of Holden's idea that the Martians may have done this for some reason. They get taken to their room, they get a little description, apparently it's like just everything's metal and clean and organised. Because as we've discussed as well at other points in time, everything's prepared for the ship being thrown around in certain directions and stuff like that. So everything has to be like magnetic and held down so it can work in no gravity, or sudden like sideways movements as well. There's lots of rounded edges as well, so people don't bump into them and kill themselves easily. And he's basically saying like, there's some Marines on the door, they'll get them some food, but do not fucking annoy them. And he says, Holden says to the people looking after them, it will be the easiest house guest you've ever had. And the Lieutenant Marine who's kind of checking them in seems like he actually appreciated it because he's a professional doing an unpleasant job. But then he immediately has to take Holden away because he's been summoned by Lieutenant Lopez. And Holden's like, shit, he's been separated from his crew, and he's like, fuck, I hope I come back to see them. Because obviously everyone's scared of the Martians at this point. And they do call them Martians, which is always a nice touch. And Holden's like, who's Lieutenant Lopez? Why am I being summoned for this? He realises it'll be an interrogation. And he's just being told he's the guy who's asked to see you, and that's it. And he enters a room with two uncomfortable looking chairs, and he sits down. He says the chair was even less comfortable than it looked. Which is an interesting one as an author, to just really, like, they only describe this room for about 2 paragraphs, and they spend about half of that talking about the chairs, which is a strange one. I don't know, I quite like it. It's just an interesting choice. And he meets Lieutenant Lopez, who turns out to be naval intelligence. And the Marines, like, they don't want to talk about him. And the guy immediately pops some white lozenges. And as he does it, his pupils contract to tiny points as he sucks on the lozenges. And it turns out these are called focus drugs, which means Holden knows he can't lie anymore. So earlier on, Holden clicked his heels together to turn off his magnetic boots. And now this man is sucking on the lozenges. Interestingly, this guy didn't tongue or chin the tablet as Holden has previously taken his medicine. I'll make sure to comment on this as we find more medicines going forward. And we basically get this interrogation where this bloke's obviously up to his titties. He's pilled to the gills on this kind of weird focus drug, and he's just pinging off individual questions at Holden, trying to find out if he lies. And he's like, Holden, you had 7 years in the UN, in the Navy, and then you punched a senior officer. Why was that? Holden's like, I was projecting self-loathing onto him, and I missed him and punched the wall, but luckily that's hitting the right person. And he's like, do you have some time to think about this? And he's like, yeah, I was on the Canterbury, and that's why I was on like these Belter ships instead after the Navy. And he's like, I realised how much the Coalition, which is Earth and Mars, has been fucking over the Belters for so long, and I didn't want to be part of the Navy anymore and be part of that boot. That's what he says. He doesn't want to be a bootlicker, which is a good boy. Pretty based. But he's like, he says at this point, I didn't switch sides, I stopped playing. I didn't renounce my citizenship, I like Montana, which is where he grew up. And I'm out here because I like flying, and only a Belter rust trap like the Canterbury will hire me. So at this point, you kind of get this background of Holden, whereby he's aware of the socioeconomic issues in the belt, and kind of the issues he's having right there. But he's not actually doing anything. He says, no, I didn't switch sides, I stopped playing. Which is, I guess you're going to see now, this whole 9-book series about Holden going, I'm not actually stopped playing the game now. And the guy saying about Holden, you're an exceedingly honest man, which is, yeah, one of the biggest Holden traits. He cannot tell a lie, and he's always telling the truth, and he wants people just to know the truth. And we get some background on Holden, which I don't think we've had yet, and it's, you were the only child of a family co-op, so 5 fathers and 3 mothers. And And it's basically the Martians are like, what the fuck is that up? And it turns out that Holden says the tax break for 8 adults only having 1 child allow them to own 20 acres of decent farmland. There are over 30 billion people on Earth, 22 acres is national park, and the DNA mix is legit. They aren't my parents in name only. And Mother Elise carried me because she had the widest hips, which is quite cool. So he was raised by like a polycule. So he's got 8 parents. We do meet them in later books, and they are quite cute in their own little way. But yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the ones where, much like I've commented on in previous episodes, all the brothels and stuff, it's kind of like they bring it up in the universe and they don't really talk about it afterwards. But it is quite cool. It's also cool seeing how if 30 billion people are on Earth, then yeah, maybe the only way to get this tax break to deal with overpopulation is to do the thing where 8 people have 1 kid and you can get a little farm. And as they're talking, this weird interrogation about Holden's like parental orgies, torpedo launchers. So the ship starts vibrating with torpedo launchers. And Holden's like, holy fuck, that's why they've got 6 belter ships who are all suicidal. And the Lopez guy is just sitting there perfectly still like a statue of these focus drugs. And they're about to continue again, and then all of a sudden they can hear general quarters alarm being sounded. And the ship starts vibrating, and they realise that the Donager itself has to fight back torpedoes being shot at it from the belters. And it's like, holy shit, this is getting real. And immediately the interview ends, and Holden gets dragged at gunpoint back to his room, and he's back with his crew. And he gets back there, and Naomi's like, "Oh, did they torture you? How are all your fingernails still attached and whatnot?" Like, obviously, all they've heard about is the Martians being fucking like autistic, proper like autistic, fully on the ball, getting the job done. Which is why there's so many jokes about being tortured by them. And they're sat there, realizing they're in this space fight all of a sudden, and all they can feel is vibrations, the alarm going off, and gravity starting to kick in again. And Shed starts panicking. He's going, it's insane, flying around in these metal bubbles and then trying to poke holes in each other. And outlining all the details about kind of long-term decompression and cold exposure, about all the horrible things that happened. And Amos is like, oh, that's awfully fucking cheerful, Doc. And Alex realises what's going on because he was ex-Navy and goes, boys, we've got to strap him tight. And at this point, everyone is strapped in but Holden, which is just bigger Holden energy of like people trying to get sorted and he's the last man there. And they're talking about, because obviously in space everything's so far apart, but there's nowhere really to hide or scream. But the idea is all these real actions thousands of kilometers away, so there's nothing going to happen for a while, and the time scales are really big because everything is so far apart. And it's like we won't know if something slipped through the flak screen till it rips the hull open. I.e., like if a torpedo gets through, they won't know until everyone's dead. And Amos is again just saying everybody is a fucking pile of fun right now. And Shed is shitting himself. Naomi and Alex are quite quiet, and it's given they're talking. The crew start talking about if they know the Donager is so powerful, whoever is attacking them is putting up a bloody good show, and they should be dead by now. And the fact they aren't is very, very creepy. And the ship's starting to vibrate, and the torpedoes are flying by, and Holden actually falls asleep. Because again, this point of kind of these space combats is not something like Star Wars, where you imagine, or Star Trek, where they're flying around in space shooting each other. Because the distances are so big, they're firing these like great torpedoes the size of a house, and they're shooting like rods of earlier on they described as like Teflon rods. I don't know why they need to be non-stick, but the idea is just like huge chunks of metal and turrets flying everywhere, but over thousands of kilometers. The space combat can take hours and hours, so people have to like fall asleep and come back in, come back out. And he falls asleep, and all of a sudden he's woken up by a huge roar, and the ship's shaking, and the gravity turns off, and they realise the Donager's been hit, and its engines have turned off, which is, Amos is yelling, shit, shit, shit. Everyone else has gone quiet, no one knows what's going on. Holden unbuckles and tries to get out the room. He needs to figure out what's going on, but the Marines outside the door have left, and they can't open the panel because they've been locked in. And then they realise the ship has been... The soft vibrations are still there, which is the little turrets trying to shoot down the torpedoes, but really big vibrations have kicked in, which is turrets firing like large kind of battleship turrets at each other. And they say, in the history of the coalition, no capital ships had ever got into a close quarters battle, which is what is indicated by the big turrets flying. And it means, so it's described as the ship's big cannons, which meant that the range was sufficiently short that a non-guided weapon was viable. Hundreds or even dozens of kilometers, not thousands. Somehow the belter ships had survived the Donager's torpedo barrage. Which is, again, yeah, even at this point, they're only dozens of kilometers apart, which is combat that like you would never ever see in like a real navy. But it's also just cool when you think how big everything is in space and there's absolutely nothing. I also like to think as well, and I think it is discussed at books like in other times, is all the rounds of like these little turrets that are spraying bullets trying to shoot down torpedoes and stuff. Will just fly around forever and ever. Like they'll hit something eventually, or just go off into the unknown. And these big turrets are firing off, and also the Donna just starts to ring like a gong being struck over and over, which is return fire being hit, which is obviously these rounds are going so fast. And then we get a final description, which is the Gorse round that killed Shed didn't even make a noise. Like a magic trick, two perfectly round holes appeared on either side of the room in a line that intersected Shed's couch. I nearly said crotch then, fucking hell. One moment the medic was there, the next his head was gone from the Adam's apple up. Arterial blood pumped out in a red cloud, pulled into two thin lines, and whirled to the holes in the walls of the room as the air rushed out. And then the chapter ends. So it's a good one. We get our first bit of space combat. And it's interesting. I find, as I've probably made it very clear so far, the way they approach space combat I think is very interesting, and I think it lends itself really well to like reading about, rather than in these big flashy visuals. Because you can see it takes time. There's a lot more, like, it's quite boring ultimately compared to like high frills, like hand-to-hand fighting or something. And I think it really works like that. It's interesting. It's interesting seeing, again, as I spoke extensively about this, particularly in the Preluge, how cohesive the universe feels. Like everything kind of makes sense, and it just seems quite logical. Such that, like, of course, the spaceships would look like office blocks, and it's just very believable. It's a universe you can buy into. But yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed that as well. I know I did. We've had a first bit of space combat, very interesting, and Shed has died. Our medic, the man who went mental last episode, has spent this episode being very scary, and he's not built for space. Our little boy Shed, and he's gone now, and he's died. And he didn't have a very good time at any point. He spent a lot of time talking about genital warts and making dick jokes with that guy with the broken arm. But now he's gone. So he lived a good life. He lived a life I'm not envious, but I'm sure he had fun. But yeah, thank you everybody, and I will see you in a couple of weeks' time.